On the 8th of May, 2014, a sensor on the main road of a Turkish coal mine read 500 parts per million of carbon monoxide, and instead of spiking and falling back the way a reading does, it held there. 500 was not a measurement of the air in that roadway. It was the highest number that instrument had been built to produce, which means the true figure is unknown, and the only thing the record can say for certain is that it was worse than the number written down. 5 days later, 301 men were dead in that mine. Soma sits in Manisa province in the Aegean hills of western Turkey, and it used to be tobacco country. The engineer's report makes the point plainly. Most of the men who died came from districts that had been tobacco-growing centers, and when that went, mining was what was left. People who had farmed went underground with little training for it. The mine was called Eynez, and the license for it, number IR 4009, belonged to a public body, the Turkish Coal Enterprise. The state owned the coal and tendered the work of getting it out to a private company. Around 3,000 people worked there. The contract set production at 1.5 million tons a year, 15 million over 10 years, and it allowed the contractor to produce more than that if it wished. The first firm to hold it produced 50,000 tons in 2006, and by 2009, it was running somewhere between 230 and 300,000, the record being inconsistent about which. Then it asked to be let out. According to the engineers, it went because the seam held methane and was prone to catching fire, and it judged mining there without a proper risk assessment extremely risky. But the mine changed hands anyway at the end of October 2009, and without a tender. The following year, output was 2.6 million tons, and by 2012 it was 3.8. Depending on which of the 2009 figures you take, the mine had grown by somewhere between 9 and 11 times in a single year, and nothing underneath it had changed. The method at Eynez was longwall mining with caving, and caving is the part that matters. You drive a long face into the coal and take it, and behind the face, as you advance, the roof is supposed to fall in. The collapse is the design working, traveling upward until the ground settles into the space the coal used to occupy and the weight is carried by the rubble. But at Soma, the roof did not come down. The rock above the seam is marl, 80 to 110 meters of it, and above that, another 100 meters of limestone. The Parliamentary Commission worked this through in its own technical session. The marl, it turns out, is very strong, and the limestone above it stronger still, so instead of collapsing, the roof stayed put, and the mine left rooms behind it. The chair of that commission described what those rooms were in 5 words of Turkish, and they are the whole video. Bunların hepsi bir gaz deposu. All of these are a gas store. Here is the scale of 1 as the commission worked it out. Take a face 110 meters wide and 200 long, cut 25 meters high, 250 meters down. You have emptied roughly 550,000 cubic meters. Into that space, the operation injected 4,000 cubic meters of ash, which is not 1% of it. By the commission's count, there were 12 other panels in the same condition, with their roofs still up and the space beneath them open. What sits in a room like that is broken coal in permanent contact with air. Coal in that state oxidizes, oxidizing coal warms up, and warm coal oxidizes faster. Left alone, it heats itself. This was not a theory anybody had to be talked into. The Turkish Bar Association's report on the disaster cites an academic study of the Eynez coal which records 10 fires in that mine between 1994 and 2002, the longest burning for 24 days. That comes through the Bar Association's citation rather than the study itself, and it was written down. Technical reports on this site in 2008, including work by Professor Bahtiyar Unver of Hacettepe University, required that the roof be caved completely. The main ventilation could not do the job alone. The engineers found its inadequacy was being made up for with auxiliary fans, roughly 25 running inside the mine, and that the S-panel was ventilated in series, meaning air that had already passed through one working area went on into the next. The principle of ventilating panels independently, they concluded, had been given up, which raises a question the mine never had to answer until the 13th of May. What happens if the power fails? There were 48 gas sensors underground, 19 of them for carbon monoxide. Sensor 470 sat at the exit of a face in the S panel, where most of the 301 would be found. Between the 2nd of March and the day of the fire, it reached 500 parts per million 16 times. Now put a number against that. The concentration at which men are not permitted to work underground at all is 50 parts per million. Sensor 470 was recording 10 times that, 16 times over 10 weeks, and the engineers who examined the logs put the rest beyond doubt. 500 marked the end of the scale rather than a reading taken off it, and the true concentration was probably far higher than the figure written down. Sensor 415, on the main road, sat at the top of the scale continuously on the 8th of May. There were two answers to this at the time, and they are not the same answer. The first came from the company, which said the high readings came from blasting. The second is that a great many were never written down. An expert report prepared for the prosecutors found the handwritten ventilation logbooks carried different values from the sensor records, and that most of the readings do not appear to have been entered at all. The book said the mine was normal. The machines said it was not. The engineers' finding on all of this in September 2014 was that there was a widespread fire problem in that mine being handled with temporary measures, and that this way of working had become routine and ordinary. Their fuller investigation 2 years later reached the same place in one sentence. The 50 parts per million danger limit had been passed repeatedly before the accident. CO Itchen, any sensor in Sander. No measure was taken, and the situation had been normalized. There is a last piece of that record which is not about instruments at all. Across many sensors, carbon monoxide had been above 50 parts per million for the previous month. The engineers drew the obvious inference. Men had been working in it and taking painkillers for the symptoms, continuously, which meant a source of carbon monoxide in that mine that was known about and not being stopped. Their sentence for it is better than any summary. For carbon monoxide, the best sensor is the human being. The instruments were not the only thing saying it. In June 2010, the Chamber of Mining Engineers published a report which named this coal field directly. As its own later report quotes it, the coal in the new working areas at Soma had been found to hold high quantities of methane as the workings went deeper, and then this. Burada hata yapılması asla kabul edilemez. A mistake here can never be accepted. Production must absolutely not be started without the necessary research and without methane drainage, and going ahead without it may cause a new disaster. That was published and dated 4 years before. We have it as they quoted themselves in 2014, not from the original. On the 23rd of October 2013, opposition deputies from Manisa filed a motion in the Turkish parliament asking for a commission to investigate the accidents happening in all of Soma's mines. It carried 60 signatures. It sat until the 29th of April 2014, when it was debated and refused by the governing party's majority. 14 days later, the mine caught fire. It would be easy to tell that as a chamber weighing Soma and choosing not to look. The record says something duller and worse. Between March 2012 and March 2013, 216 investigation motions were filed in that parliament. 50 came from the governing party, and all 50 were accepted. Every motion filed by every other party group was rejected. Nobody had to think about Soma at all. The motion was refused because of who had filed it. The third warning came from inside the mine, and it comes to us as testimony rather than as record. A miner who survived, Mehmet Ali Dincer, said that an electrical technician he worked with, Ergun Sadal, had found 17 days earlier that the cables could not carry the load of the transformers, and that the whole cable arrangement needed replacing. Sadal went to the management every day about it. He argued with them. Dincer's account is that they simply would not listen. What Dincer says Sadal told them was this: Burada buyuk felaket olacak, kimse bunun altından kalkamaz. There is going to be a great disaster here, and nobody will be able to bear it. Two things have to be said about that straight away. It is one man's account of what another man said, and no official report establishes it. And Sadal was warning about an electrical fault, which is not what the investigators concluded had started the fire. He did not predict this. He was a man on the payroll who thought the mine was going to kill people, said so to the people who could act, and was not listened to. A man on the mine safety team, Yilmaz Kiziltepe, looked at his watch at 10 minutes to 3 that afternoon. Satam utse on vardi, o sirada sate baktim kunku. Utu on gecheda patlama oldu. It was exactly 10-3 because I looked at my watch just then. And at 3:10 there was an explosion. The engineer's account from outside puts the first notice of the event somewhere between 2:30 and 3. What the investigators believe happened, and they call their reconstruction preliminary, and much of it never fully established, is this. Coal that had been heating turned to open flame roughly 1,350 meters in, near the point where the main intake airway divided north and south. That is the mining engineer's estimate. The electrical engineers put it nearer 700 meters, and the record never resolved which. The flame took hold of what was around it, the rubber conveyor belt, the electrical cables, the timber, and the compressed air pipes. Then the power went off. With the power went the auxiliary fans, the 25 standing in for a ventilation system that could not manage alone. The engineers call what followed a thermodynamic imbalance, which is a mild phrase for it. Carbon monoxide came out of every part of that mine where coal was still heating, in quantities enough to poison the men working in it. Underground, Kiziltepe heard an order from the engineer above him. Yangin var, kimse chikmasin Burdon, there is a fire. Nobody leave here. 142 of them stopped where they were, in the A panel, and waited. The telephones did not work, because the telephones ran on the power that had just failed, so there was no way to tell anybody where they were, and no way to be told anything. At about 5 o'clock, roughly 2 hours in, with men on the intake side brought out, the airflow through the mine was reversed. Where they were standing, nothing about that changed anything. 1 hour had gone by, and then a second, and then a third, and then a fourth. There is one more thing the instruments did, and the commission found it afterwards. In 2 places underground, a carbon monoxide sensor and a methane sensor sat side by side, the first pair 5 centimeters apart. In a fire, both should register at the same instant. They did not. At the first pair, the carbon monoxide registered first, and the methane followed 2.5 to 3 minutes behind. And at the second, on the return airway, the carbon monoxide again ran about 2 minutes ahead. What the commission made of that, reasoning aloud in session rather than in any published finding, was that the gas had not drifted to those sensors. It had been pushed out of the space behind the face under pressure. And there is a fact that took 2 years to reach paper. It does not belong to the A panel where those 142 stood. It belongs to the S panels, where most of the 301 were found. The S panels had no emergency exit to the surface. The company had asked for one itself, arguing in its own application that in a mine contending with methane, a gallery to the surface was necessary to get workers out by the shortest route. It was never driven. They were carrying masks, and the masks on their own are not the failure. What matters is which kind they were. What the men had, according to the engineer's report, were filter masks. A filter mask works by pulling the air around you through a cartridge that absorbs the gas out of it, which means its usefulness depends entirely on what the air around you happens to be. The report says exactly that the protective property of these masks depends on the ambient air and is limited. One caution, because the record does not close here. The engineers specify the filter type. The men who wore them describe something inside the mask running out, which is how you would describe the other kind. The inventory that would settle it was requested from the company and never handed over. It also says what should have been there instead. Experience from earlier disasters had already established that in gassy, fire-prone seams, the right equipment is the closed circuit type, which carries its own oxygen and does not care what the atmosphere outside it is doing. The mask in your hand was rated for 45 minutes, and the men waited 5 hours. Kiziltepe and the others warned the men around them not to open the masks yet, because once a mask is opened, you have to keep using it, and 45 minutes later, you are left with nothing. The ones who did not know that, or who panicked, opened theirs while the air was still relatively clean. When the gas came, they had nothing left, and you cannot walk in it. Your nose is clipped shut, you breathe through your mouth, your heart rate climbs. In his words, Oturup bekliyorsun. Onunla yürüyemiyorsun. You sit and wait. You can't walk with it. 5 men died beside him. What happened to the rest of the equipment is not a finding of any inquiry. It is what a member of the Parliamentary Commission put to it, reading the draft and finding this missing. There had been 20 oxygen masks in the S-panels that nobody knew were there, he said, and close to 150 more that were not where they should have been, in a room called the Old Life Room before it was dismantled into an infirmary. The same member said a refuge chamber, a sealed space with its own air where men can wait out a fire, was required by Turkish law at the time, and the company had not built one. That it offered an existing space as though it were one, and that afterwards the position settled into agreement that coal mines do not need them. 301 men died. From the first postmortems onward, the Forensic Medicine Institution in Izmir gave the cause of death as carbon monoxide poisoning. They did not burn to death. They were poisoned by the air they were standing in. The prosecutor's expert report of September 2014 ran to 126 pages and identified 20 separate faults. On the day itself, it found, the gas sensors registered the beginning of the accident, and the company's officials did not act on what they showed. Its conclusion was that the disaster was preventable. 4 bodies held the duty of inspecting that mine: the State Coal Enterprise, the operating company, the Mining Affairs Directorate, and the Labor Ministry's Inspectorate. The engineer's report puts their record in one sentence. Söz konusu ocakta, bu unsurların hiçbiri tarafından herhangi bir sorun tespit edilmemesi. At this mine, no problem whatsoever was identified by any of them. It stood on the books as a mine without problems. But look at what happened to the evidence. The Chamber of Mining Engineers asked 6 bodies, the company, the Mining Directorate, and the State Coal Enterprise among them, for 26 categories of documents. Item 21 on that list was the sensor records, and item 22 was the blasting records, the 2 documents between them capable of settling whether the company's explanation for those readings had ever been true. The Chamber's report records that none of it was sent, and the same member told the commission what had happened to the scene. The mine, he said, went back to the company early, while the fire was still burning and before the court's own experts had reached the place where it started, so the expert report was written by people who never saw the site. His conclusion was that this left the defense an argument nobody needed to give them. An outside authority had told the commission what it thought of the mine, and we know that because a member read the testimony back into the record while arguing about the draft. Dr. Gunnar Gertunka of the American National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health had said that with this ventilation plan, it was surprising the accident took as long as it did, and that never mind 3.5 million tons, the plan was inadequate and an invitation to an accident at 1 million. That was why the member was raising it. It had not made the draft report, and when that commission's own members were asked whether they were confident in what they had written, they could not agree on the record that they were. The mine's instruments reported the danger for 10 weeks in a number that meant at least and never at most, and the answer was that it was the blasting. And the man who said a disaster was coming does not appear in that record at all. Ergun Sadal was among the 301. His father, Dermis, went to the trial that followed and spoke to the reporters covering it. What his son had spent 17 days saying to people who would not hear it is known only because Mehmet Ali Dincer came out and repeated it. The trials took years, and the charge was never the one the families wanted. In 2018, the court at Akhisar convicted Kan Gurkan of causing death by simple negligence and gave him 15 years. His father, the chairman of Soma Holding, was acquitted along with 36 others. The Court of Cassation upheld those 37 acquittals and overturned the 15 years, and on retrial, Gurkan was sentenced to 20 for conscious negligence causing multiple deaths. 2 engineers received 12.5 years each. The state's own officials took longer. It took a finding from the Constitutional Court that Turkey had violated the procedural obligation attached to the right to life before a prosecution could begin at all. 28 public officials were charged with misconduct in office in December 2023. Their first hearing was on the 8th of May 2024, a decade after the fire. There is a memorial at Soma with 301 names on it, and the town still mines coal. Men still go down every shift, and the coal still comes up, on its way to places that will never hear any of this. The same shape in another industry is on this channel. The tailings dams above Valdistava, where a municipality asked whether the ponds were safe, and the safety check was handed to the company that owned them. For 10 weeks, the mine wrote down what was coming, in a language of parts per million, on instruments that could not count high enough to say how bad it was. It wrote it down every day, and the men who could read it decided this was simply what that mine was like. They were right about that. It was.